They were 72 and 75 years old, abandoned by their only daughter and left to die alone in a rusted mobile home. But when Margaret and Robert boarded that forgotten ship in the harbor, what they found beneath the layers of salt and decay wasn't just $260 million in lost cargo. It was a chance to rewrite the ending of a story everyone thought was already over. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The rain came down hard that Tuesday morning in Port Augustine, Oregon, drumming against the thin aluminum roof of the mobile home like 1,000 tiny fists demanding entry. Margaret sat at the edge of their sagging bed, her arthritic fingers trembling as she tried to button Robert's shirt. The fabric was worn thin in places, washed so many times the blue had faded to something closer to grey. Her husband sat perfectly still, patient as he'd always been, his weathered hands resting on his knees. "I can do it," he said softly, though they both knew he couldn't. Not anymore. Not since the tremors started 6 months ago, not since his heart medication got too expensive and they'd had to start splitting the pills in half to make them last. Margaret didn't answer. She just kept working, button by button, her jaw set in that way it did when she was fighting back tears. 53 years of marriage had taught Robert to recognize every expression on her face, every shift in her breathing, every unspoken word. Outside, the Pacific Northwest rain turned the trailer park into a maze of puddles and mud. The whole place sagged with defeat, 27 homes that had seen better decades, filled with people who had nowhere else to go. Margaret and Robert's trailer sat in the back row, number 42, the paint peeling like sunburned skin, the steps leading to the front door held together more by rust than screws. Robert was 75 now. His body carried the evidence of 46 years working the docks, loading and unloading cargo ships in weather that would have broken softer men. His shoulders were still broad but curved now, bent by time and labor. His hands, once strong enough to haul 100-pound crates, now shook when he tried to hold a coffee cup. Margaret, at 72, had worked beside him for 30 of those years. She'd been one of only 3 women on the docks back in 1976, and she'd earned her place through sheer stubborn will. She could read a shipping manifest faster than anyone, organize a cargo hold like a chess master planning 10 moves ahead. But arthritis had stolen that from her, curling her fingers into claws that ached in the rain. They had raised one daughter in this town, Emma. Born in 1974 on a summer evening so hot the hospital's air conditioning had broken down. Margaret had held her for the first time while sweat dripped down her face, and she'd thought her heart might explode from how much love could fit inside a human chest. Emma was 49 now. Living in Boston with a husband who worked in finance and 2 teenage boys Margaret had only seen in photographs. Emma called twice a year, Christmas and Margaret's birthday, and the conversations lasted maybe 10 minutes before she'd say she had to go, had to get back to something more important. The last time Emma visited was 6 years ago. She'd stayed for 2 hours, looked around the trailer with barely concealed disgust, and suggested they consider moving into a nursing home. "Separate facilities," she'd said. "Dad needs more care than you can give him, Mum, and you need to think about your own health." Margaret had watched her daughter drive away in a rented Lexus and felt something inside her chest crack like old porcelain. Robert never said much about it. He'd just held Margaret's hand and said, "We raised her the best we could." But Margaret knew. She knew they'd given Emma everything. They'd worked double shifts to pay for her college. They'd gone without so she could have new clothes, a decent car, opportunities they'd never dreamed of. And somewhere along the way, Emma had learned to be ashamed of where she came from. Now, sitting in the rain-drummed silence of their falling-apart home, Margaret finished the last button on Robert's shirt and pressed her palm against his chest, feeling his heartbeat. It was irregular, skipping like a stone across water. "We're going to be okay," she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was trying to convince. Robert covered her hand with his. "I know." The eviction notice had arrived 3 days ago, slipped under the door in a manila envelope. 30 days to vacate. The trailer park had been sold to developers. Luxury condos were coming, and people like Margaret and Robert were in the way of progress. They had $943 in their bank account. Robert's pension covered the medication if they skipped meals every other day. Margaret's Social Security paid the lot rent, except now there would be no lot to rent. She'd called social services that morning while Robert was still sleeping. A tired woman with a kind voice had explained their options. There were 2 nursing facilities with beds available, one in Portland, one in Eugene, different cities, 110 miles apart. "We don't separate married couples," the woman had said. "But with your husband's medical needs and your mobility issues, you each qualify for different levels of care. It's really the best option." Margaret had hung up without saying goodbye. She wasn't going to spend whatever time they had left sleeping in different beds in different cities, watching different TVs, dying separately after a lifetime spent together. That afternoon, while Robert napped in the worn recliner they'd bought used in 1989, Margaret walked to the corner store for milk. The rain had finally stopped, leaving everything smelling like wet concrete and pine. She picked up a newspaper someone had left on the bench outside, more out of habit than interest. She almost missed it. A small article on page 7, wedged between an ad for a used car dealership and a story about the mayor's budget proposal. The headline read, "Abandoned vessels continue to plague Port Augustine Harbor." Margaret adjusted her reading glasses and scanned the article. It talked about how the industrial harbor, the one where she and Robert had worked for decades, was now home to 17 abandoned ships. Cargo vessels left to rust when shipping companies went bankrupt or owners died without heirs. The Port Authority wanted to auction them for scrap, but legal complications kept stalling the process. One line caught her attention. Under maritime salvage law, any person who boards and maintains an abandoned vessel may file a claim of possession if no rightful owner comes forward within 90 days. Margaret read that line 3 times. She thought about the 1976 Chevrolet pickup Robert had salvaged from a junkyard when Emma was 3. He'd spent 6 months rebuilding it in their driveway, working by flashlight after his shifts ended. People had called him crazy, said it was too far gone. But Robert had seen something worth saving beneath the rust. Maritime salvage law. 90 days. Margaret folded the newspaper carefully and tucked it into her jacket pocket. When she got home, Robert was awake, staring out the small window at the grey sky. She sat beside him and placed the newspaper in his lap. "Read that," she said, pointing to the article. Robert pulled on his reading glasses, the frames held together with electrical tape. His eyes moved slowly across the words. When he finished, he looked at her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Margaret took his hand. "I'm thinking we've got 30 days before they kick us out of here. I'm thinking we've got no money and nowhere to go. And I'm thinking those ships down at the harbor are just sitting there, waiting." Robert was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a crow called out, sharp and lonely. "Waiting for what?" he finally asked. Margaret squeezed his fingers gently. "Waiting for someone crazy enough to believe something broken can still be saved." The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Margaret and Robert walked down to the harbor. The air was cold and tasted like salt and diesel fuel. Margaret had packed them both sandwiches and a thermos of coffee, the way she used to when they'd work the early shifts together. The industrial harbor sat on the eastern edge of Port Augustine, separated from the tourist piers and fishing boats by a chain-link fence and 3 decades of neglect. It had been the heart of the town once, back when shipping meant something, when cargo came and went and men like Robert built their lives around the rhythm of arriving vessels. Now it was a graveyard. They walked slowly, Robert leaning on Margaret's arm more than he wanted to admit, past warehouses with broken windows and cranes frozen in place like ancient dinosaurs. The water was dark, almost black, and it slapped against the concrete pilings with a sound like distant applause. 17 ships in various states of decay were moored along the docks or anchored in the deeper water. Most were small cargo vessels, their hulls streaked with rust, their decks littered with bird droppings and debris. A few were fishing trawlers, nets still hanging like massive spider webs. One was a decommissioned ferry, its windows shattered, its name barely visible beneath layers of grime. Margaret and Robert walked the length of the harbour, studying each vessel. Some were too far gone, listing badly or taking on water. Others were too small. They needed something that could provide shelter, something with enough space, something that hadn't completely surrendered to time. Then they saw her. The SS Marianne. She was massive, a cargo freighter that must have been 300 feet long, moored at the furthest dock where the water ran deepest. Her hull was coated in rust and barnacles, streaked with salt stains that looked like tears. But she sat level in the water, no visible damage below the waterline. Her superstructure rose 4 stories above the deck, windows intact, handrails still in place. Painted on her bow in faded white letters was her name, and below it, her registration, Portland, Oregon, 1968. "She's beautiful," Margaret whispered. Robert tilted his head, squinting against the morning light. "She's 57 years old and hasn't moved in God knows how long." "Neither have we," Margaret said, "and we're still here." They found a maintenance ladder bolted to the hull, the kind dock workers used for inspections. The metal was slick with algae and sea spray. Margaret went first, gripping each rung carefully, her arthritic hands screaming in protest. Robert followed, moving slowly, stopping twice to catch his breath. When they finally pulled themselves onto the deck, they stood for a moment, panting, looking around. The deck was a wasteland of corrosion and bird nests, but beneath it all, the bones were solid. Margaret walked carefully across the metal plating, testing for weak spots. Her years on the docks had taught her how to read a ship's structure, how to feel where the steel was still sound. "Main deck is solid," she called to Robert. "Drainage systems are clogged, but the plating hasn't buckled." Robert moved toward the superstructure, where a heavy steel door stood slightly ajar. He pulled it open with effort, the hinges groaning like something waking from a long sleep. Inside was darkness and the smell of stale air, oil, and time. Margaret clicked on the small flashlight she'd brought, and the beam cut through the shadows. They were standing in a narrow corridor with doors on either side. The walls were painted industrial green, faded but still intact. The floor was textured metal, designed to prevent slipping. They moved slowly, opening doors, exploring. The first room was a galley, the kitchen where the crew would have eaten. Metal counters were rusted but still attached to the walls. Cabinets hung open, empty except for a few ancient cans of soup, their labels too faded to read. A small dining table was bolted to the floor, 4 chairs tucked neatly beneath it. The next door opened into crew quarters, 6 bunks built into the walls, thin mattresses long ago claimed by mildew and mice. Personal items scattered across shelves, a water-stained paperback novel, a coffee mug with a faded logo, a photograph of a woman and 2 children, their faces bleached white by time. "Someone lived here," Margaret said softly. "Someone called this home." They climbed a narrow staircase to the bridge. This was the nerve center of the ship, where the captain would have stood, guiding the vessel through storms and calm seas alike. The windows were surprisingly clean, offering a panoramic view of the harbor and the town beyond. The wheel was still in place, solid brass beneath a layer of dust. Control panels lined the walls, gauges frozen at readings from decades ago. Robert moved to the captain's chair, a leather seat cracked and faded. He sat down carefully, his hands resting on the worn armrests. Margaret stood beside him, looking out at the water. From up here, Port Augustine looked different. Smaller, quieter. The town that had raised them, employed them, and then forgotten them spread out like a painting she was seeing from a new angle. "I used to load ships like this," Robert said quietly. 1969 through 2015. 46 years. I'd watch them come in empty and leave full, or come in full and leave empty. Never thought I'd be standing on the bridge. Margaret placed her hand on his shoulder. Never thought we'd need to. They spent the next 2 hours exploring every corner of the ship. They found the engine room, massive diesel engines silent and cold, but seemingly intact. They found storage lockers filled with tools, rope, spare parts. They found a small medical bay with an examination table and cabinets that once held supplies. And they found the captain's quarters. It was a small room behind the bridge, surprisingly well preserved. A narrow bed, a desk built into the wall, a bookshelf filled with navigation manuals and maritime law guides. On the desk sat a leather-bound logbook, its pages yellowed and brittle. Margaret opened it carefully. The last entry was dated August 14th, 1998, 27 years ago. The handwriting was neat, controlled. Received orders to dock at Port Augustine pending cargo transfer. Crew discharged pending resolution of ownership dispute. Vessel to remain moored until further notice. Captain James Holloway. 1998, Robert said. That was the year the Stewart Shipping Company went bankrupt. I remember. Hundreds of guys lost their jobs. Margaret flipped through more pages. The logbook told the story of the SS Marianne's final voyage. She'd been carrying cargo from Vancouver to San Francisco when her parent company collapsed mid-transit. Legal battles over who owned what had stranded her in Port Augustine. The crew had been let go. The cargo had been caught in litigation. And somehow, in the chaos and paperwork and lawyers arguing, everyone had simply forgotten about her. For 27 years, she'd sat here, waiting. Margaret closed the logbook and looked around the captain's quarters. Despite the dust and the years, it felt almost peaceful, protected, like something that had been sleeping, not dying. "We could live here," she said. Robert turned to look at her. "Margaret." "I'm serious. There's a galley, bunks, fresh water tanks that might still work, shelter from the rain. It's more solid than our trailer." "It's a ship," Robert said. "A ship that hasn't sailed in nearly 3 decades. So we're not sailing it. We're living on it. We board it, we maintain it, we file a salvage claim like that article said. 90 days. If no one comes forward with a legitimate ownership claim, maritime law says it could be ours." Robert stood slowly, his knees popping. He walked to the window and stared out at the harbour. A fishing boat was heading out toward open water, its engine a distant rumble. "Even if we could claim it, then what? We can't sail it. Can't sell it without a clear title, which could take years. We'd just be 2 old people living on a boat that's going nowhere." Margaret joined him at the window. "We're already 2 old people going nowhere. At least here, we'd be together." The word hung in the air between them. Together. Robert's jaw worked like he was chewing on something hard. His eyes got that distant look they got when he was thinking about Emma, about the daughter who'd decided her parents weren't worth the drive from Boston, weren't worth more than 2 phone calls a year. "You remember when Emma was little?" Margaret asked softly. "And we'd take her down to the docks on Saturdays? She loved watching the ships, said she wanted to be a captain someday." "She became an accountant instead," Robert said. "She became someone who forgot where she came from," Margaret corrected. "But we didn't forget. We're still the same people who worked these docks, who loaded these ships, who built a life out of nothing but sweat and stubbornness." She took his hand. "I'm not ready to give up. I'm not ready to let them separate us and stick us in different buildings in different cities to die alone. If we've only got a little time left, I want to spend it with you. Here, on this ship, fighting for something, even if it's crazy." Robert looked down at their joined hands. His were shaking slightly, the tremor that never quite went away. Hers were twisted by arthritis, the knuckles swollen and red. Together they looked like two pieces of broken machinery that somehow still functioned when fitted together. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay." They left the ship as the sun was setting, climbing down that rusted ladder with even more difficulty than they'd climbed up. Margaret's hands were bleeding a little from gripping the metal rungs. Robert had to stop 3 times, his breathing labored, his chest tight. But when they reached solid ground and turned to look back at the SS Marianne, silhouetted against the orange sky, something passed between them. A decision, a commitment, maybe the last act of rebellion they'd ever make. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in bed listening to Robert's uneven breathing, planning. They'd need supplies. Cleaning materials, food that would keep, batteries, blankets. They'd need to file the salvage paperwork with the Port Authority. They'd need to move their few possessions before the eviction took effect. And they'd need to find out what, if anything, was still inside that ship's cargo holds. Because ships like the SS Marianne didn't just carry crews, they carried cargo. And if she'd been abandoned mid-delivery during a bankruptcy, there was a chance, however small, that whatever she'd been transporting was still locked below deck. Margaret thought about the logbook, about Captain Holloway's final entry. Vessel to remain moored until further notice. 27 years was a long time to wait for notice that never came. She turned onto her side, looking at Robert's profile in the darkness. His face was peaceful in sleep, the worry lines smoothed away. They'd been so young when they met, just 19 and 22, both working at a cannery to save money for something better. They'd fallen in love over lunch breaks and shared cigarettes, over dreams of a future that included more than fish guts and minimum wage. They'd had that future for a while. A little house they'd managed to buy in 1981, steady work at the docks, a daughter who'd brought them joy even when she'd brought them headaches. Retirement that was supposed to mean rest and peace, but medical bills had taken the house. Cutbacks had gutted the pensions, and Emma had taken herself away piece by piece until she was just a voice on the phone twice a year, distant and distracted. Margaret reached out and touched Robert's hand. He stirred slightly but didn't wake. "We're going to be okay," she whispered into the dark. "We're going to save ourselves." The next day, they went back to the ship with purpose. Margaret carried 2 canvas bags filled with cleaning supplies, garbage bags and work gloves. Robert brought his old tool belt, the leather cracked and worn but still holding the wrenches and screwdrivers he'd used for 46 years. They started with the captain's quarters, the room that would become their home. Margaret scrubbed and swept while Robert checked the water systems. To their surprise, the fresh water tanks still held some water, stale and metallic tasting, but the plumbing wasn't completely destroyed. With some work and new filters, it might be salvageable. The electrical systems were another story. The ship's generators were dead, long since run dry of fuel. But Robert found a junction box that could, with the right adapter, be connected to a portable generator. It wouldn't power the whole ship, but it could provide light and heat to a few rooms. They worked until their bodies gave out, then rested, then worked again. By the end of the first week, they'd made the captain's quarters livable. The bed had new sheets Margaret had brought from home. The small desk was cleared and cleaned. Robert had rigged a battery-powered lamp that filled the room with soft yellow light. They'd also filed the salvage claim with the Port Authority. A bored clerk had barely looked at the paperwork before stamping it and filing it away. 90 days, she'd said. If someone contests it, you'll be notified. Otherwise, it'll go to Admiralty Court for review. Margaret and Robert had walked out of that office holding hands, feeling like bandits who'd just pulled off an impossible heist. On the 8th day, they moved out of their trailer and onto the ship permanently. They'd sold or given away everything they couldn't carry. The whole of their lives fit into 4 boxes and 2 suitcases. The trailer park manager had watched them go with something between pity and confusion. "You know you're crazy, right?" he'd said. "Yeah," Margaret had replied. "We know." Their first night on the SS, Marianne was cold. The wind came in off the Pacific, rattling the windows and making the hull creak like an old rocking chair. They lay together in the narrow captain's bed, wrapped in blankets, listening to the sounds of the ship settling around them. "Are we really doing this?" Robert asked in the darkness. Margaret pulled him closer. "We really are." "What do you think is down there, in the cargo holds?" She'd been wondering the same thing. The cargo holds were sealed, heavy steel doors locked with mechanisms they hadn't yet figured out how to open. But they'd found manifests in the bridge, partial records of what the SS Marianne had been carrying when she made her final stop. The manifests listed general cargo, machinery parts, textiles, industrial equipment, standard freight for a vessel her size, but there were also several entries marked with asterisks and the notation, "High-value items, secure storage required." No details, no inventory, just that cryptic note. "I think we're going to find out tomorrow," Margaret said, because tomorrow Robert was going to use his old dock tools to try to break the locks on cargo hold number 3. They fell asleep to the sound of waves lapping against the hull, 2 old people in a forgotten ship, betting their last days on the chance that something valuable might be hidden beneath their feet. Neither of them knew that what waited below deck wasn't just valuable. It was worth $260 million, and it was about to change everything. The morning came cold and grey, the kind of Pacific Northwest dawn that felt more like dusk. Margaret woke first, her body aching from sleeping on the unfamiliar mattress, her joints protesting the ship's constant subtle movement. Robert was still asleep beside her, his breathing raspy and uneven. She watched his chest rise and fall for a moment, counting the breaths the way she'd started doing lately, reassuring herself he was still here, still fighting. She slipped out of bed carefully and pulled on the heavy wool sweater she'd worn on the docks 30 years ago. It still smelled faintly of machine oil and salt air, scents that brought back memories so vivid they hurt. She made coffee on the small camp stove they'd set up in the galley, the water taking forever to boil in the cold. While she waited, she stood at the bridge windows and watched the sun try to break through the clouds. The harbour was quiet this early. A few fishing boats were heading out, their running lights blinking like distant stars. Somewhere across the water, a foghorn called out low and lonely. Margaret wrapped her hands around the warm coffee mug and thought about what they were about to do. Cargo hold number 3. She'd studied the ship's blueprints last night, old photocopies she'd found in a filing cabinet in the captain's quarters. The SS Marianne had 5 cargo holds, numbered bow to stern. Holds 1 and 2 were for general freight, accessible through large hatches on the main deck. Holds 4 and 5 were for bulk materials, grain or coal or whatever needed to be loaded by the ton. But hold 3 was different. It was smaller, climate-controlled, with reinforced walls and a separate ventilation system. On the blueprints, it was labelled Secure Storage, Restricted Access. That's where the high-value items would be. Robert emerged from the captain's quarters an hour later, moving slowly, one hand pressed against his chest. Margaret pretended not to notice, just handed him coffee and a piece of toast with strawberry jam. "You ready?" she asked. He nodded, though his hands were shaking worse than usual. "Let's see what we bought for $3,700. They made their way down through the ship's interior, following narrow staircases and corridors lit by the battery-powered lanterns they'd strung up. The deeper they went, the colder it got. Their breath misted in the air. The walls were slick with condensation, and somewhere in the distance, water dripped with a steady rhythm, like a ticking clock. Cargo hold 3 was on the second deck below the waterline, accessed through a corridor that ended in a massive steel door. The door was painted the same industrial green as the rest of the ship, but it was clearly built differently, heavier, more secure. A wheel lock mechanism sat in the center, the kind that required both strength and the right combination to open. Robert set down his tool belt and examined the lock. His fingers traced the mechanism, feeling for weak points, testing the resistance. Margaret held the lantern close, watching his face. This was what he'd done for 46 years. Mechanical problems were puzzles he'd solved with patience and experience. "It's a Jenkins Mark IV, he said. "Commercial grade. We used these on high-security containers back in the 80s. He pulled a pry bar from his belt. But they all had the same weakness. The housing pins corrode after a few years in salt air. He worked for 20 minutes, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. Margaret wanted to tell him to rest, to take his medication, to be careful. But she knew better. Robert needed this, needed to feel useful, needed to fix something, needed to prove that age hadn't stolen everything from him. Finally, something gave. A sharp crack echoed through the corridor. The wheel lock mechanism shuddered, then turned. Robert spun it 3 full rotations, and the heavy door swung inward with a groan that sounded almost human. Cold air rushed out, significantly colder than the corridor. Margaret raised the lantern, and they both stepped inside. The cargo hold was the size of a small house, maybe 30 feet by 40 feet, with a ceiling that rose 12 feet high. But what stopped Margaret's breath wasn't the size. It was what filled it. Rows of climate-controlled containers lined the walls, each one the size of a refrigerator, sealed with heavy latches and marked with shipping codes. In the center of the room stood larger crates, wooden ones reinforced with steel bands, and along the far wall, covered in protective wrapping, were shapes that looked like furniture or sculptures, impossible to identify beneath the layers of preservation material. Robert moved to the nearest container and checked the seal. "Still intact," he said. "Whatever's in here, it's been protected." Margaret found a clipboard hanging on the wall near the door. It held a manifest, yellowed, but still legible. Her eyes scanned the list, and her heart began to race. "Container A1 through a 12, fine art collection, authenticated works, climate control required. Estimated value, $42 million. Her voice cracked on the number. Robert turned to look at her. "What?" She kept reading, her hands shaking so badly the paper rattled. "Containers B1 through B6. Gold bullion, 999 fine. Secured storage. Estimated value, $68 million. Margaret. Containers C1 through C8. Gemstone collection, uncut diamonds, rubies, emeralds, sapphires. Estimated value, $83 million. She lowered the clipboard and looked at him. "Robert, there's more. Vintage wines, rare manuscripts, antique furniture. The manifest says total cargo value is $260 million. The silence that followed was so complete Margaret could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Robert moved to the nearest wooden crate and carefully pried up one corner. Inside, wrapped in acid-free paper, was a painting. Even through the protective covering, Margaret could see rich colors, gold leaf, the kind of craftsmanship that belonged in museums. "Who owned all this?" Robert whispered. Margaret flipped through the manifest pages. At the bottom of the last sheet, she found a notation. "Property of the Caldwell estate, consigned to Sotheby's Auction House, San Francisco. Delivery pending probate resolution." She remembered the article she'd read, the one about the SS Marianne. The ship had been caught in a legal battle when Stewart Shipping went bankrupt. But this wasn't company cargo. This was private property, caught in the crossfire of corporate collapse. "The Caldwell estate," she said. "I need to find out who that was." They spent the next hour carefully documenting everything they could see without opening the sealed containers. Margaret took notes on every manifest entry while Robert photographed each container with the old Polaroid camera they'd brought. The enormity of what surrounded them was almost paralyzing. $260 million. They'd spent their entire lives scraping by, working jobs that broke their bodies for wages that barely covered rent. They'd raised a daughter on boxed macaroni and hand-me-down clothes. They'd lost their home to medical bills and their dignity to eviction notices. And now they were standing in a room filled with more money than they could comprehend, on a ship they'd claimed for the price of a used car. "We need to be careful," Robert said. "We need to think about this." Margaret nodded. "We go to the library. We research maritime law, salvage rights, the Caldwell estate. We figure out exactly where we stand before we tell anyone what's down here." They sealed the cargo hold door and made their way back up to the captain's quarters. Neither of them spoke. The weight of the discovery sat between them like a third presence, heavy and impossible to ignore. That afternoon, they took the bus to the Port Augustine Public Library, a small brick building that smelled like old paper and floor wax. The librarian, a woman in her 60s named Patricia, recognized them. "Margaret, Robert, I heard you two were living on that old ship down at the harbor." Her expression was somewhere between concern and admiration. "Are you doing okay?" "We're managing," Margaret said. "Listen, we need to do some research. Maritime law, salvage rights, legal precedents. Do you have anything?" Patricia's eyebrows rose, but she didn't ask questions. She led them to the reference section and helped them pull books on admiralty law, shipping regulations, and property rights. Then she showed them to the computer terminal where they could access legal databases. For the next 4 hours, Margaret and Robert buried themselves in research. What they learned was both encouraging and terrifying. Under maritime salvage law, anyone who took possession of an abandoned vessel and maintained it could file a claim of ownership. If no legitimate owner contested the claim within 90 days, the salvager could petition an admiralty court for full ownership rights. If granted, that ownership extended to the vessel and all cargo aboard, provided the cargo itself wasn't separately claimed. The key was proving the ship was truly abandoned. And based on everything they'd found, the SS Marianne had been forgotten for 27 years. Stewart Shipping Company had dissolved in 2001. The corporate assets had been liquidated. The ship sold for scrap or auctioned off. Except the SS Marianne had somehow slipped through the cracks. As for the Caldwell estate, a newspaper archive search revealed the story. Nathaniel Caldwell had been a wealthy collector who died in 1997. His will had specified that his entire collection be auctioned, with proceeds going to establish a children's hospital in Portland. But probate had been tied up in legal challenges from distant relatives. The collection had been shipped from his estate to San Francisco for the auction, but when Stewart Shipping collapsed mid-transit, everything had ended up in legal limbo. The hospital had never been built, the relatives had eventually given up fighting, and the collection had simply been forgotten, lost in the bureaucratic shuffle of bankruptcy proceedings and maritime law. Margaret sat back in her chair, her mind spinning. So if we can prove ownership of the ship, we own the cargo. If no one contests it, Robert said, and if we can navigate the legal system without getting crushed by it. We need a lawyer, Margaret said. They couldn't afford a lawyer. They could barely afford bus fare. As they were leaving the library, Patricia stopped them. I couldn't help but overhear a bit of your research, she said quietly. My sister's daughter is a maritime lawyer in Seattle. She does pro bono work for salvagers and fishermen who can't afford representation. I could call her if you want. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you. That night, back on the ship, they sat in the captain's quarters and tried to process everything. The small space heater Robert had rigged up was working, filling the room with warmth. Outside, rain had started again, pattering against the windows. Tell me about when we were young, Margaret said suddenly. Robert looked at her, surprised. What? I need to remember why we've always fought so hard. Robert was quiet for a moment, then he smiled. You were 19, working at Pacific Cannery, wearing those big rubber boots and a hairnet, smelling like fish every night. Margaret laughed. You weren't much better. You showed up to our first date with grease under your fingernails and engine oil in your hair. I'd been working on my motorcycle, Robert said, trying to impress you. You did impress me. You were the first boy who ever treated me like I had a brain. They'd gotten married in 1970, a simple ceremony at City Hall with 2 witnesses they'd pulled off the street. Their honeymoon had been a weekend camping trip to Crater Lake because it was all they could afford. Margaret had gotten pregnant with Emma on that trip, though they hadn't known it until 6 weeks later. We were so scared when Emma was born, Margaret said. I remember you holding her in the hospital and your hands were shaking. I thought I'd drop her, Robert admitted. She was so small, I'd never held anything that precious. They'd moved into a tiny apartment above a hardware store, so small they could barely fit a crib in the bedroom. Robert worked double shifts at the docks, while Margaret stayed home with Emma for the first year. Money was always tight, but they'd been happy. Emma had been a joyful baby, always smiling, always curious. Margaret remembered pushing her in a stroller down to the docks on Robert's lunch breaks. Emma would wave at the big ships, her tiny hands reaching for them. Boat, she'd say. Big boat. We gave her everything we could, Margaret said softly. We gave her more than that, Robert said. We gave her opportunities we never had. Emma had been the first person in either of their families to go to college. Margaret and Robert had worked themselves to exhaustion to pay for it. Robert took every overtime shift offered. Margaret went back to work at the docks when Emma turned 12, despite Robert's protests that it was too hard on her. They'd been so proud at Emma's graduation. Watching her walk across that stage in her cap and gown, diploma in hand, they'd felt like every sacrifice had been worth it. When did we lose her? Robert asked. Margaret knew exactly when. It was Thanksgiving 2008. Emma had brought home her new boyfriend, a man named Derek who worked in finance. Over dinner, Derek had made a comment about blue-collar workers and people who never tried to better themselves. He'd meant it as a general observation, not a direct insult, but the way Emma had nodded along, the way she'd distanced herself from her own parents' lives, had cut deeper than any intentional cruelty. After that, the visits became shorter, the phone calls less frequent. Emma's wedding had been in Boston, a formal affair where Margaret and Robert had felt completely out of place among Derek's wealthy family and friends. Emma had introduced them as my parents from Oregon in a tone that made it clear she wished they were from somewhere more impressive. The grandchildren, Connor and Dylan, were strangers. Margaret had birthday cards from them pinned to a corkboard in their old trailer, generic store-bought cards signed in Emma's handwriting because the boys couldn't be bothered. She's ashamed of us, Margaret said. She worked so hard to become someone different that she forgot where she came from. Robert pulled her close. Then that's her loss. We built a good life. We worked honest jobs. We loved each other and we loved her. If that's not good enough, that's on her, not us. What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The next morning, they were awakened by voices on deck. Margaret sat up quickly, her heart pounding. Through the captain's quarters window, she could see 2 figures moving around on the main deck. Robert grabbed his jacket. Stay here. Like hell, Margaret said, pulling on her boots. They emerged onto the deck to find a harbour patrol officer and another man in a Port Authority uniform examining the ship. The officer was young, maybe 30, with a neatly trimmed beard and suspicious eyes. The Port Authority man was older, carrying a clipboard. "Can I help you?" Robert called out. Both men turned. The officer's hand went instinctively to his belt, though he didn't draw his weapon. "This is a restricted area," the officer said. "You're trespassing." Margaret stepped forward. "We're not trespassing. We filed a salvage claim on this vessel 8 days ago. It's all legal and documented with the Port Authority." The Port Authority man checked his clipboard. "That would be Robert and Margaret Morrison." "That's us," Robert said. "You're living on this ship?" "We are," Margaret said firmly. "We're maintaining it as part of our salvage claim. Maritime law allows for habitation during the claim period." The officer looked skeptical. "You know this thing could sink at any moment? It hasn't been inspected or maintained in decades." "I worked these docks for 46 years, Robert said. "I know how to inspect a ship. She's sound." The Port Authority man was still checking his paperwork. "The claim is properly filed," he admitted, "but there are safety concerns. If you're living here, we need to do a formal inspection." Margaret's mind raced. An inspection could lead to questions about the cargo hold, questions about what was inside. "We understand," she said carefully. "We're happy to cooperate, but we'd like to have legal representation present during any inspection. That's our right, isn't it?" The officer and the Port Authority man exchanged glances. "You're really serious about this," the officer said. "Dead serious," Margaret replied. They watched the two men leave, their footsteps echoing on the metal deck. As soon as they were gone, Margaret turned to Robert. "We need that lawyer, now." Patricia's niece was named Grace Chen, and she arrived in Port Augustine 3 days later. She was in her 40s, wearing jeans and a rain jacket, her black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She climbed aboard the SS Marianne without hesitation, her boots sure on the ladder Margaret and Robert had struggled with. "So," she said, shaking their hands, "my aunt says you two have gotten yourselves into an interesting situation." They took her to the captain's quarters and laid out everything. The salvage claim, the discovery of the cargo hold, the manifest showing $260 million in forgotten property. Grace listened without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When they finished, she sat back and let out a low whistle. "Okay, this is complex but not impossible. Here's what you need to understand. Maritime salvage law is old. It predates most modern property law. If you can prove 3 things, you have a legitimate claim." She counted on her fingers. 1. The vessel was genuinely abandoned with no reasonable expectation of the owner returning. Given that it's been 27 years and the company that owned it no longer exists, that's provable. 2. You took possession of the vessel and have been maintaining it. You're living on it. You've made repairs. You've documented everything. That's good. 3. No legitimate owner has come forward to contest your claim within the statutory period. 90 days, Margaret said. Grace nodded. 90 days from when you filed. After that, you petition the Admiralty Court. If they grant your claim, the ship and its contents become your property. But here's the complicated part. That cargo, it was separately owned from the ship, the Caldwell estate. "But the estate dissolved," Robert said. "Legally, yes. But the assets were supposed to go to charity, a children's hospital that was never built. A good lawyer could argue that the cargo should still fulfill that original intent, regardless of who owns the ship." Margaret felt her stomach drop. "So we might get the ship but not the cargo?" "Possibly. Or you might get everything. Or someone might come forward claiming to represent the estate's interests. Maritime law is unpredictable." Grace leaned forward. "But here's what I can do. I can represent you through the salvage claim process. I can help you document everything properly. And if someone does contest, I can fight for your rights. Pro bono." "Why would you do that?" Robert asked. Grace smiled. "Because my aunt told me you're good people who got dealt a bad hand and are trying to survive. And because, honestly, this is the most interesting case I've seen in years. Plus, if we win, the publicity alone would be worth it for my practice." They shook on it. Over the next week, Grace helped them build their case. They photographed every inch of the ship, documented every repair they'd made, logged every hour they spent maintaining it. Grace filed additional paperwork establishing their claim and sent formal notices to every possible interested party: the dissolved shipping company's liquidators, the state of Oregon, the Federal Maritime Commission, even the Caldwell family's last known relatives. And then they waited. During those waiting days, something else started happening. People noticed them. The harbor wasn't as abandoned as it seemed. There were still a few working docks, still fishermen who came and went, still workers at the nearby port facilities. One of them was a man named Vincent. Margaret first saw him on a Tuesday afternoon. She was on deck, hanging laundry on a line they'd strung between the mast and the superstructure. Movement caught her eye, and she looked down to see a man standing on the dock, staring up at the ship. He was maybe 65, thin and weathered, wearing a stained jacket and a baseball cap. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. They weren't curious. They were knowing. "Can I help you?" Margaret called down. The man didn't answer immediately. He just kept staring, his expression unreadable. Then he said, "I used to work on her, the Marianne. First mate, 1996 through 98. Margaret's heart skipped. "You were crew?" "Until they let us go. August of 98, told us to clear out, that the ship was going into receivership." His voice was rough, like gravel sliding. "Never thought I'd see anyone aboard her again." "We've filed a salvage claim," Margaret said carefully. Vincent nodded slowly. "I heard. Word gets around down here." He took a step closer. "Question is, do you know what you're sitting on?" Margaret felt cold despite the afternoon sun. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I was there when they loaded that cargo, saw the manifests, saw the security procedures." He looked up at her directly, saw the estimated values. "So I'm wondering if you opened hold 3 yet." Margaret didn't answer, but her silence was answer enough. Vincent smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "Thought so. Listen, lady, you and your husband seem like decent people, but you're in over your heads. That cargo, it's got a history. People have been looking for it for years. Collectors, insurance companies, treasure hunters. And now you've just announced to the world that you found it." "We haven't announced anything," Margaret said. "You filed a legal claim. That's public record. It's only a matter of time before someone puts 2 and 2 together." Vincent turned to leave, then stopped. "One more thing. I'd get yourself a good security system if I were you, because once word gets out, you're not going to be alone on this ship anymore." He walked away before Margaret could respond, disappearing into the maze of warehouses and shipping containers that lined the harbor. Margaret found Robert in the engine room, trying to get one of the auxiliary generators working. She told him about Vincent, about the warning. Robert sat down heavily on a tool chest. "He's right. We need to think about security." "We can barely afford food," Margaret said. "How are we supposed to afford security?" That night, they didn't sleep well. Every sound seemed amplified. The ship creaked and groaned as it always did, but now each sound felt like a potential threat. Margaret lay awake, listening to Robert's labored breathing, wondering if they'd made a terrible mistake. At 2 a.m, she heard it. Footsteps on deck, slow, deliberate, trying to be quiet. She shook Robert awake and pressed a finger to his lips. They listened together, hearts pounding. The footsteps moved across the deck, stopped at the door to the superstructure. Someone tried the handle. It was locked, thank God, but the lock wasn't strong. It rattled as someone pushed against it. Robert grabbed the flashlight they kept by the bed. "Stay here," he whispered. "No," Margaret whispered back, grabbing her own flashlight. "We go together." They crept through the dark corridor toward the deck access. Robert had a wrench in his free hand. Margaret had nothing but her flashlight and 60 years of refusing to back down from anything. When they burst through the door, flashlights blazing, They caught a glimpse of a figure in dark clothes scrambling toward the railing. The person vaulted over and hit the dock running, disappearing into the shadows before either of them could get a good look. "Should we call the police?" Margaret asked, her voice shaking. Robert examined the door. The lock had been damaged but not broken. "And tell them what? Someone tried to break into an abandoned ship we're squatting on? They won't care." But they both knew the real reason not to call the police. The less attention they drew to the ship and what was inside it, the better. The next morning, Vincent came back. This time he brought a thermos of coffee and a box of donuts. "Heard you had visitors last night," he said, setting the food on a crate. "That'll happen more often now. Word's spreading." Margaret crossed her arms. "And how would you know?" Vincent sighed. "Because I've been keeping an eye on the ship for 27 years. Not every night, but enough. Waiting to see if anyone would ever come for the cargo." Robert stepped forward. "Why? What's your interest in this?" Vincent was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled out a photograph from his wallet. It showed a young girl, maybe 8 years old, smiling at the camera. "My granddaughter, Lucy. She had leukemia, died in 2003, 5 years old." His voice cracked slightly. "That cargo you're sitting on, it was supposed to fund a children's hospital. Nathaniel Caldwell's whole collection, worth a fortune, all of it going to build a place where kids like Lucy could get treatment. But legal bullshit and corporate bankruptcy killed that dream. The hospital never got built, and kids kept dying." Margaret felt her chest tighten. "I'm not here to steal from you," Vincent continued. "I'm not here to contest your claim. I'm dying anyway. Cancer. Got maybe 6 months left. But if there's any chance that cargo could still do what it was meant to do, help sick kids, then I want to see that happen before I'm gone." He looked at them both with eyes that had seen too much loss. "So I'm offering to help. I'll keep watch at night, keep the scavengers away. I'll help you with the ship, with whatever you need. And when you win that claim, when all that money is yours, I just ask one thing." "What?" Robert asked. "Remember what it was supposed to be for. Remember the kids." Margaret and Robert looked at each other. They'd spent the last week thinking about what they'd do if they won the claim. Pay off debts, maybe. Get proper medical care for Robert. Find a place to live that wasn't a rusting ship. They'd thought about survival, about themselves. They hadn't thought about legacy. Margaret extended her hand to Vincent. "Okay, you've got a deal." As the sun set that evening, 3 unlikely allies sat on the deck of the SS Marianne, drinking Vincent's coffee and planning their next moves. An elderly couple who'd lost everything, and a dying man who'd spent 27 years watching a dream rust away. They didn't know it yet, but word of their salvage claim had already reached someone who would change everything. Someone who believed the cargo belonged to them. Someone who wouldn't stop until they got it back. The letter arrived on a Friday, delivered by certified mail to the ship. Margaret had to climb down the ladder and meet the postal carrier on the dock, signing for a thick envelope with a law firm's return address embossed in raised letters. Caldwell and Associates, Boston, Massachusetts. Her hands shook as she carried it back up to the captain's quarters. Robert was resting, his medication making him drowsy in the afternoons. She sat at the small desk and opened the envelope carefully, as if whatever was inside might bite. The letter was typed on heavy cream-colored paper, the kind that cost more per sheet than Margaret used to spend on groceries. She read it once, then again, then a third time before the words fully penetrated. "To whom it may concern. This firm represents the interests of the Caldwell Family Trust. It has come to our attention that you have filed a maritime salvage claim on the vessel SS Marianne, which contains property belonging to our clients. We hereby notify you that this claim is contested. The cargo aboard said vessel remains the legal property of the Caldwell estate, and any attempt to claim, sell, or dispose of said property will result in immediate legal action. You are advised to cease all activity related to this salvage claim and vacate the vessel within 10 business days. The letter was signed by someone named Jonathan Caldwell, Esquire, managing partner. Margaret set it down and stared out the window at the grey water. 10 business days. They'd been on the ship for 3 weeks. They had 67 days left on their 90-day salvage period, and now someone was trying to shut them down before the clock even finished running. She heard Robert stirring in the next room. When he emerged, rubbing sleep from his eyes, she handed him the letter without a word. His face went pale as he read. "Who are these people?" "Family of the man who owned the cargo," Margaret said, "or claiming to be." Robert sank into the chair beside her. "Can they do this? Can they just kick us out?" "I don't know. We need to call Grace." Grace arrived the next morning, the letter clutched in her hand, her expression grim. She'd brought another lawyer with her, an older man named Peter, who specialized in estate law. They sat in the cramped captain's quarters while wind rattled the windows and rain began to fall. "Okay," Grace said. "This is what I was afraid of. Jonathan Caldwell is Nathaniel Caldwell's great-nephew. He's been quietly searching for this cargo for years. My guess is someone at the Port Authority tipped him off when they saw your salvage claim." "Can he take the ship from us?" Margaret asked. "He can try," Peter said. His voice was calm, measured, like a doctor delivering a diagnosis. "The legal question is whether the cargo was properly abandoned or whether it remained the property of the estate, despite being in legal limbo for 27 years. 27 years, Robert repeated. Nobody came looking for it for 27 years. "Actually," Peter said, pulling out his own folder of documents, "that's not entirely true. Jonathan Caldwell filed a property recovery claim in 2009. He claimed the cargo was stolen when the ship disappeared. But he couldn't locate the ship, so the claim went nowhere." Margaret felt sick. "So he's been looking?" "Looking, yes. But not very hard, apparently. The ship's been sitting in this harbour the whole time. If he'd bothered to check maritime records or actually visit Port Augustine, he would have found it years ago." Grace leaned forward. "Here's our argument. Under maritime law, if cargo is abandoned with the vessel and no good faith effort is made to recover it within a reasonable time frame, salvage rights can supersede original ownership. Jonathan Caldwell let this cargo sit for 27 years. He filed one claim and gave up. That's not good faith recovery effort. That's treasure hunting when convenient." "Will that argument work?" Robert asked. Grace and Peter exchanged glances. "Maybe," Grace said. "Depends on the judge. Admiralty Court judges have a lot of discretion. Some are very traditional, very protective of property rights. Others are more pragmatic about salvage law." "So we're gambling," Margaret said. "You've been gambling since the day you climbed aboard this ship," Peter said, not unkindly. "The question is whether you want to keep gambling or fold now." That night, Vincent showed up with his usual thermos of coffee and something else, a shotgun. He saw Margaret's expression and shook his head. "Relax, it's not loaded, just for show. But word's really getting around now. I heard some guys at the dock talking about checking out the ship when you're not around." Robert took the shotgun, examining it with the familiarity of someone who'd grown up in rural Oregon. "You think we'll need this?" "I think you need people to think you have it," Vincent said. "Perception is half of security." They sat together on the deck, wrapped in blankets against the cold, watching the lights of Port Augustine twinkle in the distance. Vincent had started coming by every evening, sometimes bringing food, sometimes just company. He'd told them more about his life, about the years he'd spent at sea, about coming home to find his granddaughter sick, about watching the hospital fundraising campaign collapse when the cargo disappeared. "My daughter still blames me," he said quietly. "Says if I'd been around more, if I hadn't been out at sea all the time, maybe I would have noticed Lucy's symptoms earlier. Maybe she'd have had a better chance." Margaret understood that guilt, the weight of what-ifs and should-haves. "Your daughter's wrong," she said. "You work to provide for them. That's what parents do." Vincent smiled sadly. "Is it? Or do we just tell ourselves that while we miss the important moments?" The question hung in the air between them like fog. 2 days later, the Port Authority sent their own letter. This one was delivered by a deputy sheriff who looked embarrassed to be there. The letter informed them that due to safety concerns and questions about the legitimacy of their salvage claim, they were being ordered to allow a full inspection of the vessel within 72 hours. Failure to comply would result in the claim being voided and potential criminal trespassing charges. "They're trying to force us out," Robert said after the deputy left. Grace, who'd driven down the moment they called, agreed. "Jonathan Caldwell has money and connections. He's putting pressure on the Port Authority. They want you gone so this whole mess becomes someone else's problem." "What happens during this inspection?" Margaret asked. "They'll go through everything. Check structural integrity, safety systems, living conditions. And they'll definitely want to see what's in that cargo hold." Margaret's stomach turned. If they see what's down there, if they document it, doesn't that help Caldwell's case? Possibly, but hiding it helps his case too. It makes you look like you're concealing evidence. Grace rubbed her temples. This is the problem with salvage law. It assumes everyone's acting in good faith. But money this big, it brings out the worst in people. The inspection was scheduled for Monday morning. Margaret and Robert spent the weekend cleaning, organizing, making the ship look as maintained and safe as possible. Vincent helped, his thin frame climbing up and down ladders, his breath coming in labored gasps that he tried to hide. "You should rest," Margaret told him. "You're sick." "I'm dying," Vincent corrected. "There's a difference. Rest won't change anything. Might as well be useful while I can." Sunday evening, as they were finishing up, Robert collapsed. One moment he was carrying a bucket of cleaning supplies. The next he was on the deck, clutching his chest, his face grey. Margaret screamed his name and dropped to her knees beside him. Vincent was already pulling out his phone, calling 911. The ambulance took 20 minutes to arrive, 20 minutes during which Margaret held Robert's hand and begged him not to leave her. Not now, not like this. The paramedics loaded him onto a stretcher and carried him down the ladder with practiced efficiency. "I'm coming with you," Margaret said, climbing into the ambulance. "Ma'am, are you family?" "I'm his wife of 53 years. They let her ride. At the hospital, doctors rushed Robert into emergency care. Heart attack, they said. Significant damage. They'd need to run tests, possibly surgery. Margaret sat in the waiting room under fluorescent lights that made everything look dead, her hands still shaking, her mind blank with terror. Grace showed up an hour later, somehow having heard. She brought coffee and sat beside Margaret in silence, just being present, which was exactly what Margaret needed. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. Finally, a doctor emerged, still in surgical scrubs. "Mrs. Morrison, your husband is stable. We performed an emergency stent procedure. He's going to need extensive rest and medication adjustments. He's very weak." "Can I see him?" "He's sleeping, but yes." Robert looked small in the hospital bed, hooked up to machines that beeped and hummed. His face was pale, his breathing steady but shallow. Margaret pulled a chair close and took his hand, careful not to disturb the IV. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm right here." His eyes fluttered open. "The inspection," he mumbled. "Forget the inspection. Forget the ship. You're what matters." "No." His grip tightened slightly. "We don't give up. Not now." Tears ran down Margaret's face. "Robert, you almost died." "But I didn't. I'm still fighting." He managed a weak smile. "Still stubborn as hell, just like you." The doctor said Robert would need to stay hospitalized for at least a week. Margaret refused to leave his side, sleeping in the chair beside his bed, eating vending machine food, ignoring the nurses who said she should go home and rest. Grace handled the inspection. She met the Port Authority officials at the ship Monday morning, with Vincent there as a witness. They went through every inch of the vessel, documenting everything. When they reached cargo hold 3, Grace let them in. She told Margaret about it later, visiting during evening hours. They saw it all: the containers, the manifest, the estimated values. The lead inspector's eyes nearly popped out of his head. What did they say? Not much, just took photos and notes, but I guarantee that report is going straight to Jonathan Caldwell's lawyers. Margaret closed her eyes. So we've lost. No, actually seeing the cargo helps us. It proves you weren't concealing anything, that you acted in good faith, and it confirms the value, which strengthens your salvage claim. If that cargo's been sitting there for 27 years with nobody claiming it, that's powerful evidence of abandonment. But Caldwell's going to fight harder now. Absolutely. This just became a $250 million lawsuit. 2 days later, Margaret's phone rang. The screen showed a number she knew by heart but rarely saw anymore. Emma. Margaret's first instinct was to ignore it, but something, maybe exhaustion, maybe the fear of losing Robert, made her answer. Mom! Emma's voice was tight, strained. I just saw you on the news. You and Dad are living on some abandoned ship? What the hell is going on? Margaret felt anger rise in her throat like bile. Nice to hear from you too, Emma. It's been, 7 months since your last phone call? Don't do that. Don't make this about me. I'm trying to understand why my parents are homeless and living on a boat. We're not homeless. We have a home. It just happens to float. Mum, seriously? The news is saying you found some treasure or something? That you're in a legal battle? And Dad's in the hospital? He had a heart attack. He's stable now. There was a pause. Is he going to be okay? I don't know. He needs medication we can't afford. He needs rest we don't have the money to provide. So yes, Emma, we found something valuable, and we're fighting to keep it because it might be the only chance we have to survive. Mum, listen. Derek and we've been talking. We could help. We could send some money for Dad's medical bills. Margaret laughed, the sound harsh and broken. Now? Now you offer? Where were you 6 months ago when we got evicted? Where were you when we were choosing between food and medication? Where were you when your father's hands started shaking so bad he couldn't hold a coffee cup without spilling it? I didn't know it was that bad. You didn't ask. You haven't asked about our lives in years, Emma. We were just an embarrassing detail from your past. The dock worker parents who didn't fit into your Boston society life. That's not fair. Isn't it? When was the last time you introduced us to your friends? When was the last time you brought the boys to visit? When was the last time you called just to say you love us, not because something dramatic happened and you saw it on the news? Emma was crying now. Margaret could hear it in her breathing. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But let me help now. Whatever you're fighting for, whatever that cargo is worth, I'm your daughter. I should be part of this. And there it was. The real reason for the call. Margaret felt something inside her chest, something that had been cracked for years, finally shatter completely. No, she said quietly, you don't get to be part of this. You abandoned us, Emma. You chose your comfortable life over us, and that's fine, that's your choice, but you don't get to come running back now that there might be money involved. Mom, please. We raised you better than this. We gave you everything we had. We worked ourselves to death so you could have opportunities, and you repaid us by being ashamed of where you came from. Margaret's voice broke. Do you know what your father carries in his wallet? A picture of you from college graduation, 1996. That's the last photo he has where you looked at him like he mattered. I never meant to hurt you, but you did, and now you need to live with that. Just like we're living with being forgotten. Margaret hung up. Her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped the phone. Grace had been sitting quietly in the corner of the hospital room. She came over and placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder. That was brave. That was cruel. No, that was honest. And sometimes honesty feels cruel because we're not used to it. That night, while Robert slept, Margaret went through his personal belongings. The nurses had put them in a plastic bag, his wallet, his keys, his wedding ring they'd removed for surgery. She opened the wallet, and there it was, the photo of Emma in her graduation gown, smiling, young, full of promise. But tucked behind it was something else. A letter, folded small, the paper worn soft from being handled. Margaret unfolded it carefully. It was addressed to Emma, dated 2 years ago. Robert's handwriting, shaky but legible. Dear Emma, I started this letter 100 times and never sent it. Your mother doesn't know I write to you. She'd say I was being foolish, holding on to something that's already gone, but I'm your father, and fathers never stop hoping their daughters will come home. I don't understand what we did wrong. We loved you. We sacrificed for you. We were so proud of everything you became. But somewhere along the way, you stopped being proud of us. I see it in your eyes when you visit, that flash of embarrassment. I hear it in your voice when you rush off the phone. You've built a good life, and I'm happy for you. But I miss you. I miss the little girl who used to sit on my shoulders at the docks, who said she wanted to be a ship captain when she grew up. I miss having a daughter who loved me. If you ever read this, know that we never stopped loving you. Even when you stopped calling. Even when years passed between visits. Even when you looked at us like we were strangers. You're still our little girl. You always will be. I hope someday you'll remember that we're still your parents, and that we're still here. Love always, Dad. Margaret pressed the letter to her chest and sobbed. For the daughter they'd lost. For the man lying in the hospital bed who'd carried this hope in his wallet for 2 years. For all the words that should have been said and never were. When she finally composed herself, she made a decision. She took a photo of the letter with her phone and texted it to Emma. No message, just the photo. Then she put the original back in Robert's wallet, right behind the graduation picture. Emma could do with it what she wanted. 3 days later, Robert was released from the hospital with strict orders to rest, avoid stress, and take a new cocktail of medications that cost more per month than their old rent. The doctor pulled Margaret aside. Mrs. Morrison, I need to be honest with you. Your husband's heart is severely damaged. Another episode like this, he might not survive. He needs a calm, stable environment, proper nutrition, regular medical monitoring. I understand. Do you? Because living on an abandoned ship while fighting a legal battle doesn't sound calm or stable. Margaret met the doctor's eyes. You're right. But what's the alternative? We have no home, no money, and a daughter who only called because she saw us on TV. That ship is all we have, and what's inside it might be our only chance at the life you're describing. The doctor sighed. Then I hope you win, for his sake. Grace drove them back to the harbour. Robert was quiet during the ride, staring out the window at the familiar streets of Port Augustine. When they pulled up to the dock, Vincent was waiting with a wheelchair he'd borrowed from somewhere. Don't even argue, he said, when Robert opened his mouth to protest. Save your strength for the fight ahead. Back aboard the SS Marianne, they settled Robert in the captain's quarters. Margaret had cleaned it thoroughly, bought new blankets, set up his medications on the desk like a pharmacy display. Vincent had installed a small space heater that actually worked, making the room almost comfortable. That evening, Grace brought news. The Port Authority accepted our inspection report. They're not going to void your salvage claim, but Jonathan Caldwell has filed a formal legal challenge in Admiralty Court. There's going to be a hearing in 10 days. What kind of hearing? Robert asked from the bed. Preliminary, to determine if there's sufficient grounds for him to contest your claim. If the judge rules in his favor, this goes to a full trial. If the judge rules for you, your claim stands and the cargo becomes yours pending the 90-day period. And if we lose the hearing? Margaret asked. Grace hesitated. Then you'll likely be ordered to vacate the vessel and turn over the cargo to Caldwell Family Trust. 10 days. They had 10 days to prepare for a hearing that would determine everything. Peter, Grace's colleague, arrived the next day with boxes of legal precedents and case files. He and Grace set up a makeshift office in the ship's old radio room, covering the walls with notes and timelines. Our argument is straightforward, Peter explained. The cargo was effectively abandoned. No good faith recovery efforts were made for 27 years. You salvaged the vessel, discovered the cargo, and acted transparently by documenting and reporting everything. Under maritime law, that gives you legitimate salvage rights. What's their argument? Robert asked. That the cargo was never abandoned, merely lost. That Nathaniel Caldwell's will specifically designated it for charitable purposes, and those purposes should still be honored regardless of how much time has passed. They'll argue that you're treasure hunters trying to profit from someone else's property. But we are trying to profit, Margaret said quietly. We need this money to survive. Peter nodded. And that's okay. Salvage law exists precisely to reward people who recover valuable property that others have failed to protect. You're not stealing. You're claiming what was abandoned. Vincent, who'd been listening from the doorway, spoke up. What about the hospital, the charity angle? Grace looked at him. What do you mean? Nathaniel Caldwell wanted his collection to fund a children's hospital. What if Margaret and Robert committed to doing the same? Not all of it, obviously, they need to live. But what if they pledged a significant portion to actually building that hospital? Wouldn't that undermine Caldwell's argument? The room went silent. Margaret looked at Robert. Robert looked at Margaret. They'd been so focused on survival, on keeping what they'd found, they hadn't thought beyond that. But Vincent was right. This money had been meant for something greater. How much would we need to keep? Margaret asked. To get Robert proper medical care, to live somewhere safe, to not worry about money for the first time in our lives? Peter did some quick calculations. Conservatively, 5 million would set you up comfortably for the rest of your lives. Excellent medical care, a house, security. 5 million out of 260 million. The rest goes to the hospital, Robert said. His voice was weak but certain. That's what it was supposed to be for. That's what it should be for. Margaret felt tears in her eyes again, but this time they weren't from grief. They were from pride. Her husband, dying, broke, abandoned by their daughter, was still thinking about other people's children. Are you sure? She asked him. He took her hand. We've never had money, Margaret. We've survived this long without it. What we need is enough to live with dignity. The rest, those sick kids, they need it more. Grace and Peter exchanged glances. This changes everything, Grace said. If you're willing to commit to the charitable intent to actually fulfill Nathaniel Caldwell's wishes, you're not just salvagers. You're executing his will. That's a completely different legal position. We'll need documentation, Peter said, already pulling out forms. A binding commitment. We'll establish a foundation, put the money in trust for the hospital construction. You'll be the donors, but you won't be able to change your minds later. We won't want to, Margaret said. Over the next week, they worked around the clock. Grace and Peter prepared the legal filings. Vincent helped spread the word to local media, talking about how an elderly couple was fighting not just for themselves, but to honor a dead man's dream of helping children. Margaret sat with Robert, both of them going through the cargo manifest, deciding what would be sold and what would be kept for the hospital's museum. And Margaret wrote her own letter. Not to Emma, but to the grandchildren she barely knew, Connor and Dylan. Telling them about their grandfather, about the kind of man he was, about the choice he'd made, even when he had nothing. She didn't know if they'd ever read it, but she wanted it to exist. The night before the hearing, Margaret couldn't sleep. She stood on the bridge of the SS Marianne, looking out at the dark water, at the lights of Port Augustine reflecting off the waves. Behind her, Robert slept in the captain's quarters, his breathing steady but laboured. Below her, in the sealed cargo hold, sat a fortune that might save them or destroy them. Vincent appeared beside her, silent as always. "You ready?" "No," Margaret said honestly. "I'm terrified." "Good. Means you understand what's at stake." They stood together in the darkness, two people who'd lost almost everything, waiting for dawn and the fight that would determine what happened next. In 10 hours, they'd walk into an Admiralty court and face Jonathan Caldwell and his army of lawyers. They'd present their case, their truth, their commitment to something bigger than themselves. And a judge would decide if two forgotten people on a forgotten ship deserved a second chance, or if the world would take even this away from them. The Admiralty Courthouse in Portland was a federal building from the 1930s, all marble columns and echoing hallways that made Margaret feel very small. She and Robert sat on a wooden bench outside courtroom 4, waiting to be called. Robert's hands trembled as he gripped his cane, the new medication making him dizzy. Margaret held his other hand, her arthritic fingers intertwined with his shaking ones. Two broken people holding each other up. Grace and Peter flanked them like bookends, both wearing their best courtroom suits, both projecting confidence Margaret didn't feel. Across the hall, Jonathan Caldwell sat with 4 lawyers, all of them in matching navy suits, all of them looking like they'd stepped out of a catalogue for expensive legal representation. Jonathan Caldwell himself was maybe 50, with silver hair and the kind of tan that came from country club golf courses. He glanced at Margaret and Robert once, his expression somewhere between pity and contempt, then returned to his conversation with his legal team. "He doesn't think we have a chance," Margaret whispered. "Good," Grace said. "Overconfidence is a weakness." Vincent had wanted to come, but his latest chemotherapy session had left him too weak. He'd called that morning, his voice hoarse. "Kick his ass," he'd said. "Do it for Lucy, do it for all of them." The courtroom doors opened. A bailiff called them inside. The room was smaller than Margaret expected, panelled in dark wood with high windows that let in cold morning light. The judge's bench sat elevated at the front, empty for now. There were 2 tables facing it, one for each side. Grace directed Margaret and Robert to the left table, while Jonathan Caldwell's team took the right. People filled the gallery behind them. Margaret turned and was surprised to see familiar faces. Patricia from the library, the Port Authority inspector who'd checked the ship, several dock workers Robert had worked with years ago, and in the back row, partially hidden, a woman who looked eerily like Emma. But when Margaret blinked, she was gone, probably just wishful thinking. "All rise," the bailiff announced, the Honourable Judge Catherine Morrison presiding. Everyone stood as the judge entered. She was in her 60s, African-American, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense expression. She took her seat and gestured for everyone else to do the same. "This is a preliminary hearing," she began, her voice clear and authoritative, "to determine whether there are sufficient grounds to contest the salvage claim filed by Robert and Margaret Morrison regarding the vessel SS Marianne and its cargo. Mr. Caldwell, your petition is claiming prior ownership of said cargo. Is that correct?" Jonathan Caldwell's lead attorney stood. He was tall, polished, exactly the kind of lawyer money could buy. "Yes, Your Honor. The cargo aboard the SS Marianne was the sole property of Nathaniel Caldwell, my client's great-uncle. His will explicitly stated that the entire collection was to be auctioned with proceeds funding the construction of a children's hospital. That intent has never been rescinded or fulfilled. And the Morrisons claim salvage rights. Is that your understanding?" Grace stood. "Yes, Your Honor. The vessel was abandoned for 27 years with no legitimate recovery efforts. My clients boarded it, maintained it, and filed proper salvage claims. Under maritime law, they have legitimate rights to both vessel and cargo." Judge Morrison nodded. "I've reviewed the preliminary filings. Mr. Thompson, present your argument." Jonathan Caldwell's lawyer launched into a presentation that lasted nearly an hour. He talked about Nathaniel Caldwell's legacy, his philanthropic vision, the tragic circumstances that prevented the hospital from being built. He showed photographs of Nathaniel with sick children, documents showing his charitable donations over the years, testimony from medical professionals about the need for pediatric cancer facilities. It was effective, emotional, designed to make Margaret and Robert look like opportunistic vultures picking at a good man's bones. Then he brought up their eviction, their financial struggles, their daughter's estrangement. "These are desperate people, Your Honor. They saw an opportunity for a windfall and took it. They have no connection to Nathaniel Caldwell's vision, no commitment to charitable work. They simply want to profit from someone else's tragedy." When he sat down, Margaret felt sick. Every word had been true, which somehow made it worse. Grace stood for their turn. She was smaller than Caldwell's lawyer, younger, less polished, but when she spoke, her voice carried steel. "Your Honor, my colleague paints my clients as opportunists. Let me paint a different picture. Robert Morrison worked the docks of Port Augustine for 46 years, loading and unloading ships exactly like the SS Marianne. He loaded the cargo that built this country, that kept commerce flowing, that connected us to the world. He did it in rain, in snow, in heat that melted asphalt. He destroyed his body doing it." She pulled out photographs. Margaret recognized them, pictures from their old albums that Grace had asked to borrow. Robert, in his 20s, lean and strong, standing beside a cargo crane. Robert in his 40s, showing Emma how ships worked. Robert in his 60s, still working despite the pain. Margaret Morrison worked beside him for 30 years, one of the first women allowed on those docks. She faced harassment, discrimination, and physical labor that would break most people. But she persisted because she needed to feed her daughter, to give her opportunities they never had. More photographs. Margaret as a young woman, tough and defiant. Margaret and Robert on their wedding day, barely more than kids. Margaret holding baby Emma, exhausted but smiling. They gave everything to their daughter. They worked themselves to exhaustion so she could go to college, build a better life. And when they got old, when they got sick, when medical bills took their home and their dignity, that daughter abandoned them. She moved across the country and forgot they existed. Margaret saw Jonathan Caldwell shift uncomfortably. Everyone in the gallery was silent. "So yes, Your Honor, they are desperate people. Desperate people who got evicted from a trailer park at 72 and 75 years old. Desperate people who faced being separated into different nursing homes in different cities after 53 years of marriage. Desperate people who made one last gamble, who bought a salvage claim on an abandoned ship for $3,700 because it was literally all they had left." Grace placed a document on the judge's bench, and then they discovered the cargo, and they did something remarkable. They didn't hide it. They didn't try to sell it on the black market. They documented everything. They contacted authorities. They filed proper legal claims. They acted with complete transparency and good faith. She paused, letting that sink in. "But here's what really matters, Your Honor. When they learned what that cargo was supposed to be for, when they understood Nathaniel Caldwell's vision, they made a choice. A choice to honor that vision even though they have every reason to keep every penny." Grace placed another document down. "This is a binding legal commitment. The Morrisons are pledging $255 million of the cargo's value to establish the Caldwell Morrison Pediatric Hospital Foundation. They're keeping $5 million to cover medical care and basic living expenses. Everything else, 98% of the value, goes to building the hospital that Nathaniel Caldwell dreamed of." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Jonathan Caldwell's face went white. "Furthermore," Grace continued, raising her voice over the noise, "they're stipulating that the hospital be named after Nathaniel Caldwell, that his legacy be honored, that his vision finally be realized. They're not stealing from him, Your Honor. They're finishing what he started. Judge Morrison banged her gavel. Order. Mr. Thompson, did you know about this commitment? Caldwell's lawyer stood, clearly rattled. We were not informed, Your Honor. This appears to be a last-minute attempt to— It's not last minute, Peter interrupted, standing. We filed the foundation documents with the court 3 days ago. Your clients received copies. If they didn't read them, that's not our problem. Judge Morrison looked down at her paperwork, flipping through pages. I have the filing here, dated and properly submitted. She looked at Jonathan Caldwell directly. Mr. Caldwell, the Morrisons are offering to do exactly what your great-uncle wanted. Build a hospital for sick children. The only difference is their name will be on it too. Do you have an objection to that? Jonathan Caldwell stood slowly. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Your Honor, we believe the cargo rightfully belongs to the Caldwell estate. The manner of its distribution should be our family's decision. Except your family has had 27 years to recover this cargo and build this hospital. You filed one claim in 2009 and then apparently gave up. Is that correct? There were legal complications, Your Honor. The ship's location was unknown. The ship was moored in Port Augustine Harbor the entire time. Public records. Any competent investigator could have found it. The judge's tone was sharp. It seems to me you weren't very committed to your great-uncle's vision until someone else found the money. Jonathan Caldwell's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Judge Morrison turned to Margaret and Robert. Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, please stand. They stood together, Robert leaning heavily on his cane, Margaret supporting him with one arm around his waist. And you're telling this court that you're willing to give up $250 million? Yes, Your Honor, Margaret said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. Why? Margaret looked at Robert. He nodded slightly, encouraging her to speak. Because it's not ours, she said simply. We didn't earn it. We just found it. And because my husband almost died last week. We sat in that hospital, and all I could think was how many other families were sitting in hospitals, scared and broke, watching someone they love slip away. We can't save everyone. But this money, it could save some. It could give families hope. And maybe, after a lifetime of feeling forgotten, we could leave something behind that matters. Her voice cracked. We don't have much time left, Your Honor, but we have enough time to do something good, something that outlives us. That's worth more than any amount of money. The courtroom was dead silent. Several people in the gallery were crying. Judge Morrison studied them for a long moment. Then she looked at Jonathan Caldwell. Mr. Caldwell, your great-uncle wanted to help children. These people are offering to make that happen. If you continue contesting this claim, you're not protecting his legacy. You're preventing it. Do you understand that? Jonathan Caldwell looked at his lawyers. They whispered urgently among themselves. Finally, he stood. Your Honor, could we have a brief recess to discuss? 15 minutes. The break felt like 15 hours. Margaret and Robert sat in the hallway while Grace and Peter paced nervously. Other people came up to them, strangers mostly, saying they'd heard the story, saying they were pulling for them, saying what they were doing was beautiful. An older woman with kind eyes approached Margaret. My grandson had leukemia. He didn't make it. But if this hospital gets built, maybe other grandmothers won't have to bury their babies. Thank you. Margaret couldn't speak. She just nodded and held the woman's hand. When they were called back in, Jonathan Caldwell looked different, deflated somehow. His lawyer stood and addressed the judge. Your Honor, after consultation with my client, we are withdrawing our contest to the salvage claim. The Caldwell family acknowledges the Morrisons' rights to the vessel and cargo, contingent upon their binding commitment to the hospital foundation being honored. Judge Morrison raised an eyebrow. Mr. Caldwell, is this your decision? Jonathan Caldwell stood. Yes, Your Honor. My great-uncle would have wanted the hospital built. If the Morrisons are genuinely committed to that, then continuing this fight would dishonor his memory more than sharing the credit. For the first time, he looked directly at Margaret and Robert. I apologize. I thought you were trying to steal from my family. I was wrong. Judge Morrison nodded. Very well. The salvage claim filed by Robert and Margaret Morrison is hereby validated. Upon completion of the 90-day statutory period, they will assume full ownership of the vessel SS Marianne and all cargo therein, subject to the terms of the charitable foundation as filed with this court. This hearing is adjourned. The gavel came down. Margaret didn't remember standing, didn't remember Grace hugging her or Peter shaking Robert's hand, didn't remember the reporters shouting questions or the cameras flashing. All she remembered was Robert's arms around her and his voice in her ear saying, "We did it. We actually did it." Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. News of the hearing had spread and people wanted to see the elderly couple who'd chosen charity over fortune. Grace tried to shield them, but Margaret stopped her. "It's okay," she said. A reporter thrust a microphone toward them. "Mrs. Morrison, how does it feel to give away $255 million? Margaret looked at the camera. "It feels like we're finally doing something that matters. We worked our whole lives and felt invisible. Now we have a chance to be remembered for something good. That's not giving anything away, that's gaining everything." The clip would be played on every news station in the country by evening. The ride back to Port Augusten was quiet. Robert fell asleep in the back seat, exhausted from the stress. Grace drove while Margaret stared out the window at the passing landscape, still not quite believing it was real. "You know your lives are about to change dramatically," Grace said. "The media attention, the foundation work, the hospital construction. It's going to be intense." "We can handle it," Margaret said. "We've handled worse." When they pulled up to the harbor, Vincent was waiting on the dock. He looked terrible, his skin grey, his frame even thinner than before, but he was smiling. "You won," he said. It wasn't a question. "We won," Margaret confirmed. Vincent closed his eyes and took a shaky breath. "Good, that's good." He opened them again. Lucy would be so happy. Over the next weeks, everything moved fast. Lawyers drew up the foundation paperwork. Appraisers catalogued the cargo. News crews did stories about the forgotten ship and the elderly couple giving away a fortune. Donations started pouring in from people inspired by the story, wanting to contribute to the hospital fund. Robert's health stabilized with proper medication. The foundation covered all medical expenses immediately, even before the cargo was officially sold. A donor paid for them to stay in a small apartment in town while the ship underwent official preservation work, but they still visited the SS Marianne every day. It had become more than their home. It was a symbol. Emma called 2 weeks after the hearing. Margaret almost didn't answer, but Robert encouraged her. "Mom?" Emma's voice was thick with tears. "I saw your interview. All of them. And I read Dad's letter." Margaret said nothing. "I was wrong about everything. I was ashamed of you and I shouldn't have been. You're the bravest people I've ever known. You always were. I just couldn't see it." "Emma, no, let me finish. I can't undo the years I wasted. I can't take back the times I should have called and didn't. But I want to try. I want to be part of your lives again. Not because of the money, I swear. Because you're my parents, and I love you, and I've been a terrible daughter." Margaret felt tears on her face. "You weren't terrible. You were human. You made mistakes. We all did. Can I come visit? Bring Connor and Dylan? Let them meet their grandparents properly?" Margaret looked at Robert. He was listening, hope written across his tired face. "Yes," Margaret said. "Yes, come visit." Emma arrived 3 days later with 2 teenage boys who looked uncomfortable in the small apartment. Connor was 16, Dylan 14. They were polite but distant, clearly dragged along against their will. But then Robert started telling stories about the docks, about the ships, about the time he and Margaret had accidentally gotten locked in a cargo container overnight and had to wait for morning to be discovered. The boys started laughing, started asking questions, started seeing their grandparents as actual people. On the second day, Emma asked to see the ship. They all went together, climbing aboard the SS Marianne. Margaret showed them the captain's quarters where she and Robert had lived. Grace had arranged for the cargo hold to be opened for viewing, and they descended into that cold space together. The boys stared in awe at the sealed containers, at the manifest listing millions in art and gold and gems. Dylan, the younger one, spoke quietly. "You could have kept all of this. You could have been rich forever. Why didn't you?" Robert knelt down, his joints protesting until he was eye level with his grandson. "Because being rich isn't the same as being valuable. Your grandmother and I, we were valuable to each other, to the people we worked with, to the community we built. But nobody saw that value. We were invisible." He gestured around the cargo hold. "This money, if we kept it, we'd just be rich, invisible people. But if we use it to help others, if we build something that saves lives, then we become part of something bigger. We matter in a way that lasts." Dylan thought about that. Then he said, "I think you already mattered, Grandpa. You just couldn't see it." Robert's eyes filled with tears. He pulled both boys into a hug, and Emma joined them, and Margaret stood watching her family come back together in the belly of a ship that had given them a second chance. 6 months later, they broke ground on the Caldwell Morrison Pediatric Cancer Center. The ceremony was held on a clear spring morning in Portland, on land donated by the city. Hundreds of people attended, families with sick children, cancer survivors, medical professionals, and dock workers from Port Augustine who'd worked with Robert decades ago. Vincent was there, in a wheelchair now, oxygen tank at his side. He'd lived longer than doctors predicted, determined to see this moment. Beside him was his daughter, Lucy's mother, holding a photograph of the little girl who died 20 years ago. Jonathan Caldwell came too, surprising everyone. He approached Margaret and Robert before the ceremony. "I wanted to apologize again," he said. "Properly this time. What you're doing, what you've given, it's extraordinary. My great-uncle would be proud, and so am I." He handed Margaret an envelope. "This is a donation to the foundation, $2 million from the Caldwell family. It's the least we can do." Margaret took it, speechless. Jonathan smiled. "We should be partners in this, honoring his memory together." The ceremony began with speeches from the governor, the mayor, medical directors. But when it came time for Margaret and Robert to speak, they kept it simple. Robert went first, his voice amplified by a microphone carrying across the crowd. "My wife and I spent most of our lives being told we didn't matter. We were just workers, just bodies that moved cargo from one place to another. But we mattered to each other. And now, because of an abandoned ship and a fortune we never earned, we get to matter to families we'll never meet, to children we'll never know. That's not charity. That's grace." Margaret took the microphone. Her hands didn't shake anymore. The new medication had helped. "Someone asked me if I regret giving away so much money. The answer is no, because money doesn't keep you warm at night. It doesn't hold your hand when you're scared. It doesn't make you feel seen. People do that. Purpose does that. Knowing you've helped someone, that does that." She looked out at the crowd, at all the faces watching them. We were forgotten by almost everyone. Our daughter, our community, the world. But then we found something that had also been forgotten. And together, that ship and us, we remembered what it means to matter. So this hospital, it's not just for sick children. It's for everyone who's ever felt invisible. Everyone who's ever wondered if their life meant anything. You matter. You all matter, and we hope this place reminds people of that. The applause was thunderous. Vincent's daughter spoke next, her voice breaking. My little girl died because we couldn't afford the treatment she needed, because the nearest children's hospital was hours away, and we couldn't take that much time off work. This facility would have saved her. It will save others. The Morrisons gave my daughter a legacy, gave Lucy's death meaning. I can never repay that. When it came time to turn the first shovel of dirt, Margaret and Robert did it together, their hands wrapped around the same handle. Cameras flashed. People cheered. And somewhere in the crowd, Emma stood with her arms around her sons, crying and smiling at the same time. Construction took 18 months. Margaret and Robert visited the site every week, watching the building rise from foundation to frame to finished structure. It was beautiful, all windows and light, designed to feel hopeful rather than clinical. They'd insisted on that. Vincent died before it opened. He passed quietly in his sleep, 6 months into construction. His daughter asked if they would speak at his funeral. Margaret told stories about him keeping watch over the ship, about his commitment to honoring Lucy's memory, about how he'd believed in them when nobody else did. He was family, she said at the service, not by blood, but by choice, and that's the strongest kind. They scattered his ashes in the harbour near the SS Marianne. The ship had been officially donated to the city as a historical landmark, preserved as a reminder of the story. Tours ran daily, with all proceeds going to the hospital foundation. The hospital opened in the spring of 2027. The ribbon cutting was attended by thousands. The main entrance hall featured a wall of photographs. Nathaniel Caldwell as a young philanthropist, Lucy smiling in a playground, Vincent in his naval uniform, and Margaret and Robert standing on the deck of the SS Marianne, old and weathered and defiant. Beneath the photos, a plaque read, "To all who feel forgotten, you matter. Your story matters. This place stands as proof that second chances are real and that ordinary people can do extraordinary things." The first patient admitted was a 6-year-old boy named James with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. His parents couldn't afford treatment at private facilities, but here everything was covered by the foundation. Margaret and Robert met him on his first day, bringing him a toy ship. "For when you get better," Robert said, "so you can remember that even broken things can sail again." James hugged the ship to his chest. "Are you the people who gave all the money?" "We're the people who found it," Margaret corrected gently, "and decided to share it with kids like you." "Thank you," James whispered. Watching him walk into treatment with his parents, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years. Completeness. They'd been broken people on a broken ship, and together they'd built something whole. Emma and her family moved back to Oregon a year after the hospital opened. She'd left her job in Boston, citing family as the reason. Derek supported the decision, having been humbled by his in-laws' example. The boys enrolled in local schools and spent weekends with their grandparents, learning about ships and docks and the value of honest work. One evening, the whole family gathered for dinner in Margaret and Robert's apartment, the one the foundation maintained for them. It was small but comfortable, filled with photos from the hospital opening and letters from families they'd helped. Connor, now 17, asked the question everyone had been thinking. "Grandpa, do you ever regret it? Giving up all that money? You could have been millionaires living in mansions." Robert looked at Margaret. She smiled. He turned back to his grandson. "Son, your grandmother and I lived in a trailer with a leaking roof and worked ourselves half to death for 46 years. We raised a daughter who we thought we'd lost. We got evicted and forgotten and left to die separately in nursing homes. Then we took one crazy chance on an abandoned ship and it gave us everything." He gestured around the table. "We have our daughter back. We have you boys. We have a hospital saving lives. We have purpose and meaning and the knowledge that we mattered. If we'd kept the money, we'd just have bigger problems and emptier hearts. This way, we're rich in the only ways that count." Margaret added softly, "We were dying when we boarded that ship. Dying inside, broken, alone, scared. And that ship, that cargo, it didn't just give us money. It gave us a reason to keep living. It reminded us that our story wasn't over, that we still had chapters to write. She reached across the table and took Emma's hand, including this one, the chapter where we get our family back. Emma squeezed her mother's fingers. "I'm so sorry I left. I know, but you came back. That's what matters." 2 years after the hospital opened, Robert's health finally gave out. He died peacefully in his sleep, Margaret beside him, holding his hand as she'd held it for 57 years. The funeral was massive, attended by hundreds of families whose children had been treated at the Caldwell Morrison Center. Emma gave the eulogy. "My father was a dock worker. He loaded ships in rain and snow and brutal heat. He came home exhausted every night with barely enough money to feed us. And for most of my life, I was ashamed of that. I thought he was small, insignificant." Her voice broke. "But he was a giant. He just showed it quietly, by working until his body broke, by loving my mother through 57 years, by choosing to give away a fortune so children he'd never meet could live. He was the biggest person I've ever known. I just couldn't see it because I was looking at the wrong things." Margaret sat in the front row, dry-eyed. She'd cried all her tears already. Now she just felt gratitude. Gratitude that they'd had those last years together, that they'd mattered, that Robert had died knowing his life meant something. She scattered his ashes at sea from the deck of the SS Marianne. Emma, the boys, Grace, Peter, and dozens of former dock workers stood with her. As Robert's remains touched the water, a ship's horn sounded from the harbour, a salute to one of their own. Margaret lived another 4 years. She spent them working with the foundation, visiting patients, telling their story to anyone who'd listen. She became a grandmother in truth, not just title, attending the boys' graduations, their first jobs, their relationships. When she finally passed at 80, the hospital was treating its 3,000th patient. Over 100 children who would have died now lived because of what she and Robert had done. Her last words to Emma, spoken in a hospital room ironically located in the very building she'd helped create, were simple. "We mattered. Tell everyone we mattered. Anyone can change the world if they're brave enough to believe that forgotten things still have value and that the smallest acts of courage can echo forever." As the sun set over Port Augustine Harbour, the SS Marianne sat preserved and proud, her hull gleaming with fresh paint, her decks walked daily by visitors learning her story. And in Portland, the Caldwell Morrison Pediatric Cancer Center stood bright against the evening sky, every window lit, every room filled with hope, every patient a testament to what 2 old people chose to do when the world gave them one last chance. Because Margaret and Robert Morrison weren't just salvagers who found a fortune on an abandoned ship. They were proof that it's never too late to start over, that being forgotten doesn't mean you're finished, and that the greatest treasures aren't the ones you keep, they're the ones you give away. Their legacy wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in lives saved, families kept together, and the reminder that ordinary people can do extraordinary things if they're willing to believe they still matter. And somewhere in the archives of that hospital, in a small display case, sat a brass key from the SS Marianne, the key that opened everything, not just a cargo hold, but a second chance, a new chapter, and proof that sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of another. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories are waiting for you. Click to keep discovering with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe second chances are real and that forgotten dreams still deserve to soar.